The night Duchess Vivienne Ashford nearly bled to death, her husband was 30 miles away with his hands on another woman's waist. That is the fact England would whisper about for years, not in scandal sheets, not in courtroom testimony, but in drawing rooms where women with careful smiles leaned toward each other and spoke the Duke of Blackthorn's name the way you speak about a wound that never quite healed. Damien Blackthorn was the most powerful nobleman in England. He commanded fear the way other men commanded respect, and on the worst night of his wife's life, he was simply gone. Stay with this story, because what happened next is not what anyone expected, least of all him. The labor began just after 10 o'clock. Mrs. Harrow, the head housekeeper, heard the first cry from 2 floors below. Not a sound of pain exactly, more like something tearing loose from its moorings. And she dropped the candle she was carrying and ran. By the time she reached the Duchess's chamber, the maids were already clustered at the door in various states of uselessness, hands pressed to their mouths, eyes wide and helpless in the way of people who understand that something has gone badly wrong but lack the authority to say so aloud. "Move," Mrs. Harrow said. They moved. Inside the room, Vivienne Ashford, 23 years old, 7 months along, married to the Duke of Blackthorn for 2 years and 4 months, was gripping the bedpost with both hands and breathing in the deliberate, measured way of someone who has decided that panic is a luxury they cannot afford. Her nightgown was already damp at the hem. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and no one had thought to feed it, and the room was cold in the particular way of old stone houses in November. A cold that settled into the walls and refused to leave regardless of what you burned. "Where is Dr. Pemberton?" Mrs. Harrow said. Not a question, an order delivered to the room at large. "Sent a rider an hour ago," said the youngest maid, a girl named Polly, whose hands were shaking. "He hasn't come yet." "And His Grace?" Silence. The kind that answers everything. Vivienne turned her head. Her face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with blood pressure dropping in real time. And her eyes, gray, always gray, the color of water before a storm, fixed on Mrs. Harrow with an expression the housekeeper would remember for the rest of her life. Not anger, not desperation, something worse than both. The flat, exhausted recognition of a woman who has already done the math and arrived at an answer she didn't want. "He isn't coming," Vivienne said. Her voice was steady. That was the worst part. "Don't waste the riders." "Your Grace, we must be— I said don't." She turned back to the bedpost. Her knuckles had gone white. "Send for the midwife from the village. Get more blankets. Stoke the fire." A pause, just long enough to be deliberate. "And close the door. I don't want an audience." Mrs. Harrow closed the door. She stood in the corridor for 3 seconds, which was as long as she could afford, and then she went to find someone to send for the midwife and someone else to locate the Duke, because those were 2 problems, and she only had authority over one of them. Damien Blackthorn did not know his wife was in labor. He would say this later, repeatedly, to anyone who asked, and several people who didn't. He would say it the way men say things that are technically true and morally catastrophic, with the careful emphasis of someone who has identified the one fact that might save him and intends to hold on to it regardless of what it costs everyone else. He did not know. That much was accurate. What was also accurate? He had been at the lakeside villa for 3 days. The villa belonged to Lord Ashby, a man whose primary social function was providing other men with places to conduct business they preferred not to conduct at home. Damien had ridden out on a Tuesday morning with 2 servants and no forwarding address left at Blackthorn, which was not unusual. He traveled often. He traveled without ceremony. He had spent the first year of his marriage treating his own home like a posting inn where he occasionally slept. Lady Celine Whitmore had arrived at the villa on Tuesday afternoon, which was also not unusual, because she had been arriving places that Damien happened to be for the better part of 8 months. She was 26, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, possessed of a face that commanded attention and a mind that operated 3 moves ahead of the room at all times. She had identified Damien Blackthorn as a target the way a hunter identifies terrain. Not with desire exactly, but with the cold professional appreciation of someone who understands exactly what is at stake and has already decided the outcome. Damien, for his part, understood none of this. He thought she was simply a woman who found him interesting. Men of his position frequently made that mistake, and it cost them in proportion to how long it took them to recognize it. "You should stay another night," Celine said. They were at the window. Outside, the lake was dark and perfectly still, and the sky had the greenish tint of a storm building somewhere to the north. Damien had a glass of brandy in his hand that he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. "I told you," he said. "I'm leaving in the morning. You've been saying that for 2 days." "I mean it this time." Celine tilted her head. She had a way of looking at him that was simultaneously attentive and slightly amused, as though she were watching a man attempt something she already knew he would fail at. "Your wife sent 3 letters in the past week," she said. "Did you read them?" "I don't discuss Vivian with you." "Of course not. You simply don't read her letters and discuss something else with me." She picked up her own glass and turned away from the window with the unhurried grace of someone who has never needed to rush toward anything in her life. "I'm only curious what she writes about, whether she knows." Damien set down his glass. Something moved through his face, not guilt, not quite, but its biological precursor, the animal awareness that a line has been approached. "Knows what exactly?" "What you've been thinking about." Celine looked at him over her shoulder. "What you've been saying to me for months. Whether she can read it on you when you come home." She paused. "Can she?" The fire cracked. Outside, the first thunder rolled in from the north, distant and patient, a sound like a warning from someone who has decided not to raise their voice. Damien didn't answer. That was its own kind of answer. What he did not know, what Celine did not tell him, was that Vivian's most recent letter had not discussed feelings or suspicions. It had informed him that she had been experiencing early contractions for the past 4 days, and that the physician was concerned and that she wanted him home. It had been a careful letter. Vivian wrote all her letters with care, the way someone walks across ice, deliberately, without sudden movements, conserving weight. She had not begged. She had stated facts, because she had learned that begging Damien Blackthorne for anything produced approximately the same result as begging the weather. The letter had been intercepted 3 days before it reached him. Celine had a contact among the Blackthorne household staff, a footman named Ellis, who had debts and the moral flexibility that tends to accompany debts. And Ellis had been quietly managing Damien's correspondence for months. Anything from Vivian, anything that might bring the Duke home ahead of schedule. The replacement letter, the one Damien eventually received, if he received it at all, said simply that Vivian was resting comfortably and did not require his presence. Vivian had not written that letter. By midnight, the storm had arrived. It came with the full theatrical conviction of an English November. Lightning over the moors, rain driving horizontally against the windows, wind that found every gap in the old stone walls of Blackthorne and turned the corridors into something that hummed. The servants moved through the house in clusters, because moving alone felt wrong tonight. The house itself seemed to know something was happening in its east wing and did not approve. The midwife arrived at 11:30, a woman named Agnes Croft, who had delivered most of the children in a 20-mile radius, and who walked into the Duchess's chamber with the brisk, no-nonsense energy of someone for whom this was Tuesday, regardless of what it felt like to everyone else. She took one look at Vivian, and her expression changed in a way she could not entirely conceal. "How long?" she said. 3 hours, Vivian said. She was on the bed now, propped against pillows, her face the color of old candle wax. There was a quality to her stillness that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone who has put everything unnecessary down in order to carry the one thing that matters. "Something's wrong. Tell me what's wrong." Agnes did not insult her by denying it. "You're losing more blood than I'd like." "The child." "The child is positioned correctly, but you're early, Your Grace, and there's no pretending otherwise." "Then tell me what I need to do." Agnes told her, and Vivian did it. Every instruction, every demand her body made, with a focus so complete it was almost frightening. Polly, who had been pressed into service as the additional pair of hands the midwife required, would say later that she had never in her life seen anyone fight the way the Duchess fought that night. Not with rage, not with drama. With a kind of ruthless, quiet determination, as though she had located some deep interior lever and was holding it down with both hands regardless of the cost. 3 times during those hours, Vivian thought she was going to die. Not in a dramatic, swooning way. In the specific, clinical way of someone who can feel their body's resources being tallied and found insufficient. The blood pressure, the cold, the way the room kept tilting slightly on its axis and required conscious effort to correct. She was aware of the child, her son, as it turned out, born just before 2 in the morning, small and red, and making a sound like a question rather than a cry. She was aware of Agnes moving efficiently around her. She was aware of the storm outside, lightning painting the room white every few minutes. She was aware that Damien had not come. That awareness sat in her chest the way a splinter sits in a finger, not constantly agonizing, but always there, a small hot point of pressure that flared whenever she moved in a certain direction. She did not let herself think about it directly. Direct thoughts were expensive tonight, and she was rationing. She thought instead about the child, whether his lungs were working properly, whether the thinness of his cry meant weakness in his chest, whether Agnes's face, which remained professionally neutral, was concealing something worse than she was saying. "Is he breathing?" Vivian said. "He's breathing." "Is it enough?" Agnes looked at her. "He's small," she said, honestly. "And he came too early. There's no good way to say that, Your Grace. But he's here, and he's breathing, and those are the two things that matter tonight." Vivian looked at her son, this small, urgent, wrinkled fact of a person who had arrived 3 months ahead of schedule into a cold room in a house where his father had not bothered to come home. Something moved through her. It wasn't sentiment exactly. It was more structural than that. Something in her architecture shifting, certain walls coming down, others going up. A renovation she hadn't planned for but recognized as necessary. She reached out and touched his head with 2 fingers very gently, the way you touch something that you're afraid will break. "You came early," she said quietly, to him specifically, not to the room. "You'll have to learn to do that everywhere. The world doesn't wait." Agnes, pretending to be busy with something at the foot of the bed, said nothing. Outside, the storm began to thin. The lightning grew less frequent. The rain, which had been hammering the windows with genuine intent, settled into something steadier and less dramatic. The house stopped humming. Mrs. Harrow, who had been in the corridor for the past 2 hours with a candle she kept forgetting was burning down, finally permitted herself to sit on the floor with her back against the wall. Her hands were folded in her lap. She was not a woman given to strong expressions, but her face in that corridor, alone except for the guttering candle, held something that looked very much like controlled fury. The writer they'd sent for the Duke had returned 3 hours ago. His Grace, the writer reported, had been located. His Grace had received the message. His Grace had said he would depart in the morning. Mrs. Harrow had not told Vivian this. She intended to tell her eventually. When Vivian was stronger. When there was a right moment, if such a thing existed. She was not certain such a thing existed. Damien Blackthorne arrived at Blackthorne Estate at 8:30 in the morning, when the storm had passed and the grounds were wet and gray and the whole world looked wrung out. He came through the main entrance to a silence that was different from ordinary silence. The silence of a house that had been through something and hadn't decided yet how to talk about it. The butler met him in the entrance hall with an expression that Damien registered as wrong without being able to immediately identify why. Too careful. Too deliberate. The face of a man constructing a neutral surface over something that was very much not neutral underneath. "Your Grace," the butler said. "Where's my wife?" Damien said, because the silence was already communicating something and his body was already responding to it before his mind had caught up. "Her Grace is resting, sir. The physician is with her now." A pause. "And the young lord, as well." The world rearranged itself. "The child came," Damien said, "last night, Your Grace, just before 2 in the morning." Damien stood very still in the entrance hall of his own house, while November light came through the high windows and fell across the marble floor in long, gray strips. He calculated, very quickly, the distance between last night and right now. The hours, the storm he had watched from the window of a lakeside villa, while Celine refilled his glass and told him something that seemed important at the time, though he could not now remember what it was. "He's alive," Damien said. Not a question. More like a man testing the structural integrity of a floor before he puts his full weight on it. "Yes, sir. Small," the physician says, "and early, but alive." "And my wife?" Another pause. Fractionally longer than it should have been. "Her Grace is resting," the butler said again. The repetition did not reassure. It had the quality of a sentence that has been carefully chosen to be technically accurate. Damien went up the stairs. He went quickly. Not running, but with the particular controlled speed of someone who is using forward motion to prevent themselves from thinking too hard. The corridor outside Vivian's chamber was empty, except for Mrs. Harrow, who was standing by the window with her hands folded and her face arranged in a way that said she had been there a long time and had decided on her position. She looked at him when he appeared. She did not say good morning. She did not say anything. She simply looked at him with her hands folded and her expression giving nothing away, and the not giving anything away was itself a statement. Damien reached for the door handle. "Your Grace," Mrs. Harrow said. He stopped. She lost a significant amount of blood. The housekeeper's voice was level, informational, the voice of someone delivering a report rather than an accusation, though the difference was academic. The midwife from the village managed it. Dr. Pemberton arrived at 3 in the morning. He said if she had not had the care she did, the outcome may have been different. A pause. His word was different. He meant worse. Damien said nothing. "Your son's lungs are weak, sir. The physician is cautiously optimistic, which I understand to mean he does not know and is reserving judgment." She turned back to the window. "I thought you should know the summary before you go in." He stood there for a moment. Behind the door he could hear almost nothing, just the low murmur of the physician's voice, and then silence. He had been at a lake house 30 miles from here, while his wife bled in a cold room without him. He had been standing at a window with a glass of brandy, while a midwife he had never met kept his wife and son alive. He had received a message. The writer had confirmed he received a message, and he had said he would come in the morning. He had come in the morning. He pushed open the door. Vivian was in the bed. The physician stood near the window with his bag open, making notes in a small leather journal. In a cradle beside the bed, a cradle that had been prepared months ago in anticipation of March, not November, there was a very small bundle wrapped in white that was producing the faint, persistent, somewhat questioning sound of a newborn who has not yet made up his mind about the arrangement. Vivian looked up when the door opened. She looked at Damien. That look was the thing that would stay with him. Not the physician's expression, which was carefully professional. Not the room, which smelled of herbs and something metallic beneath them. Not even his son's voice, thin and real in the cradle beside her. Vivian's face, when she looked at him, was not angry. Anger would have been something. Anger had heat in it, had energy, had the implication that she still expected something from him and had been denied it. What was on her face instead was simpler and worse than anger. It was the face of a woman who had needed something very desperately and had stopped needing it sometime during the night, not because she got it, but because she found a way to survive without it, and survival had required her to put it down permanently. She looked at him. She didn't speak. Damien opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. Her voice was quiet. Not cold. Coldness would have been a temperature, would have implied its own opposite. This was something that had moved past temperature entirely. "Vivian, I said don't." She turned her head toward the cradle, toward the small, uncertain sound coming from it. "His name is Edward," she said, to the room, not to Damien specifically. "I decided last night." He hadn't been consulted. He understood, standing in the doorway of his own son's birth room, that this was not an oversight. The physician had turned toward the window with the focused attention of a man who has decided this portion of the scene does not include him. The cradle went on, making its small sound. Vivian's hands were folded over the blanket, and she was looking at the wall, and the morning light was coming through the window in the gray, used-up way of light after a storm, and everything in the room was carrying the weight of a night that Damien had not been present for. He stepped inside. He closed the door behind him. He stood at the foot of the bed, and he looked at his wife, and he had absolutely nothing to say that was going to be sufficient. He knew this. He was a man who dealt in sufficiency, who had spent his entire life ensuring that he had the right leverage, the right information, the right position before he committed to anything. He had never in his adult life stood somewhere and had nothing. "I didn't know," he said finally, because it was the only thing that was true. Vivian looked at the wall. "The letters," he started. "Damien." Her voice, when she said his name, had the quality of a door being closed, not slammed, closed deliberately, with the latch clicked carefully into place. "I would like you to meet your son." He came around the bed. He looked into the cradle. Edward Blackthorne was smaller than Damien had expected, smaller than he thought a person could be, and still contain what people contained. His face was red and slightly startled looking, as though he had arrived somewhere and was still taking stock. His hands were clenched at his sides in the instinctive way of newborns, holding on to something that wasn't there. His breathing was audible. That was the wrong word, but it was the word Damien kept coming back to, the visible work of each breath, the small chest lifting and settling with an effort that should not have been visible. Something happened in Damien's chest. It was not a comfortable thing. It was the kind of feeling that arrives before a man has decided whether he is going to acknowledge it, and then is simply there regardless. He reached down and touched the baby's hand. The tiny fist opened slightly, automatically, the way newborns' fists open, without volition, the pure animal reflex of it, and closed around Damien's finger. He stood like that for a long time. When he finally looked up at Vivian, she was watching him. Something had shifted in her face. Not warmth, not forgiveness, nothing he had any right to. But she was watching, and watching was something, was the last remaining thread of something that had been much larger and much stronger before last night pulled at it. The physician says his lungs need watching, Vivian said. I know. He'll need consistent care, consistent presence. The emphasis was fractional. It was also unmissable. Damien held his son's hand. Yes. Good, she said, and she turned away from him again toward the window, toward the gray morning, toward some internal position she had constructed during the night that was fortified and self-sufficient and did not include a door. He was still holding the baby's finger when the physician cleared his throat and mentioned gently that the Duchess needed to rest. Damien straightened. He looked at his wife, the back of her head, the deliberate line of her shoulders. He went to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. Behind him, Vivian said nothing. The baby made its small, questioning sound. Outside the window, the storm was entirely gone, and the sky was the flat, empty white of a slate wiped clean. I'm going to find out what happened, Damien said. Still nothing from Vivian. The letters. Why I wasn't... He stopped, pressed his hand against the door, started again. Something isn't right with how this happened, and I'm going to find out what it is. The silence stretched, then, from the bed, quietly, without turning. 3 letters, Damien. Her voice was almost conversational. Almost. I sent you 3 letters in the past week. Did you read any of them? He had read one. The one that said she was resting comfortably and did not require his presence. He had read it and felt relieved and gone back to the villa window and his glass of brandy and the woman who kept refilling it. The cold moved through him. No, he said, which was the only honest answer left. I don't think I did. The door opened before he could touch the handle. Ellis the footman stood in the corridor. Ellis, who had been with the Blackthorn household for 3 years. Ellis, who Damien had never had a reason to examine too closely. Ellis, whose face in this moment had the particular quality of a man who has made a calculation and is discovering it was wrong. Behind Ellis, Mrs. Harrow. And in Mrs. Harrow's hand, a small stack of letters, 5, perhaps 6, unopened, their seals broken and repressed with the slightly too careful smoothness of someone who had opened them and done their best to close them again. She held them out to Damien. Her eyes went briefly, deliberately, to Ellis, then back to the Duke. Damien looked at the letters. He looked at Ellis. He looked at the handwriting on the top envelope. Vivian's handwriting, unmistakable, careful, and precise the way she did everything. The date on the top letter was 10 days ago. Your Grace, Mrs. Harrow said, very quietly, I think there is something you need to know. The letters were not the worst of it. That was the thing Damien kept circling back to, standing in the corridor outside his wife's chamber with 5 intercepted envelopes in his hand, and a footman in front of him who had run out of things to look at that weren't the Duke's face. The letters were evidence of something. The letters pointed at something larger and colder and more deliberately constructed than a footman with debts could have designed on his own. Damien understood systems. He had built enough of them to recognize one when it was pointed back at him. He looked at Ellis. Ellis had the look of a man who has been calculating his odds for the past 30 seconds and doesn't like the numbers. Inside, Damien said. He said it the way he said most things, without raising his voice, without particular emphasis, in the flat, even register of a man who has not needed volume in a very long time, because the absence of it tends to produce more fear than the presence of it. Ellis went inside. Mrs. Harrow followed. Damien came last and closed the door to the small sitting room at the end of the corridor, the one that faced the moors, the one with the window that was always slightly cold no matter the season. He set the letters on the table. He did not sit down. How long? He said. Ellis said nothing. His jaw worked slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is deciding between two versions of a story and hasn't committed to either one yet. I'm going to ask you one more time, Damien said, and then I'm going to stop asking and start assuming, and my assumptions will be considerably less favorable to you than the truth. How long? 8 months. Ellis's voice came out smaller than he probably intended. Approximately. The number landed in the room and sat there. 8 months. Nearly the entire duration of Vivian's pregnancy. Damien did the arithmetic without wanting to. The letters that hadn't arrived, the messages that had gone unanswered, the times he had wondered briefly whether Vivian had stopped trying and concluded that she had, and decided this meant something about her rather than examining the infrastructure of how his mail was being managed. Who? Damien said. Ellis pressed his lips together. The name, Damien said. Or I start with what I already know and work outward, which will take considerably longer and involve considerably more people, and you will be among the last to benefit from whatever arrangement you're hoping to negotiate. A pause. Then, Lady Whitmore. The name did not surprise him. That was its own revelation. The not surprise of it, the way the pieces assembled themselves into a shape he had already been looking at without registering what it was. Celine. 8 months of managed correspondence, 8 months of Vivian's letters arriving as silence, or as forgeries, smooth and falsely reassuring, telling him his wife was fine, that she did not need him, that everything at Blackthorn was quiet and well. He had believed it because he had wanted to. That was the part that would cost him, not Celine's mechanism. Mechanisms could be dismantled. The part that would cost him was the 8 months of choosing not to look too closely at something that confirmed what was convenient. He had been handed a version of his marriage that required nothing from him, and had accepted it without pulling at the seams. Mrs. Harrow was watching him from across the room. She was not watching him with sympathy. She was watching him with the particular attention of a woman who has been managing the consequences of other people's decisions for 30 years and is waiting to see whether this particular man is going to do something useful or something else. Lock him in the groundskeeper's rooms, Damien said. Don't let him send messages. I'll deal with him this afternoon. She nodded once. And find out who else. He picked up the letters. Ellis didn't manage this alone. Find out every name, every person in this house who touched anything that was meant to reach me or meant to reach my wife. I want a list by noon. Yes, Your Grace. He left the room. He did not go directly to confront Celine. That impulse, the one that wanted to move immediately, to drive 30 miles back to the lakeside villa and stand in front of her and demand an accounting, he recognized it as the kind of impulse that a younger version of himself would have followed before he understood that rage is only useful when it's directed, and direction requires information he did not yet have. Instead, he went to his son. The nursemaid, a woman named Greta, who had been hired in anticipation of March and had spent the past month preparing herself for a spring arrival, was in the chair beside the cradle looking exhausted in the specific way of someone who has been keeping vigil all night without authorization to stop. The room was warmer than Vivian's chamber had been. Someone had made sure of that sometime during the night, someone who understood that warmth was the one thing available to offer. Damien stood over the cradle. Edward was asleep. His small chest moved with that visible labored effort that Dr. Pemberton had noted clinically and Damien could not look at clinically, no matter how he tried. The rise and fall of it was too explicit, too much like something that could stop. Each breath seemed to require a decision. He is fighting, Damien thought. 3 months early, lungs half-formed, arrived into a cold room in a storm without his father present to do a single useful thing, and he is fighting. The thought did something to him that he could not have named precisely and did not try to. He reached into the cradle, touched the back of one tiny hand with 2 fingers, the way he had in Vivian's room, and felt the fingers curl without opening, tighter this time, less reflexive, something that felt marginally more like intention. He stood there for a moment, the Duke of Blackthorn with power over half the county and total powerlessness over the 4 pounds of determined life in front of him, and felt the specific weight of that imbalance settle into his chest. He took to feeding well, Greta said carefully from the chair. Twice in the night. That's a good sign, Dr. Pemberton said. Yes, Damien said. He's small, but there's something in him. She seemed to realize she was offering an opinion to a duke and adjusted her posture. "Forgive me, Your Grace." "Don't," he said. He straightened. "There is something in him. You're not wrong." He left the nursery. He went to his study. He sat at his desk for the first time in 4 days. And he looked at his correspondence. The real correspondence. The stack that Ellis hadn't managed to intercept. And he started from the beginning. The message he sent to the lakeside villa arrived at noon. It was brief. Damien wrote briefly when he was most serious. Ornament in language was something he associated with uncertainty, with the impulse to pad what was thin, and he had never been uncertain in his professional life about what he wanted. The message said only that his business at the estate required his immediate and extended attention, and that he trusted Lady Whitmore would understand. The message that came back arrived at 3 in the afternoon, which was faster than the distance warranted. Celine had been waiting. "I heard about your wife. I'm so relieved she's recovering. These early arrivals are frightening. Do take care of yourself, Damien. I'll be here when things settle." He read it twice. She had heard about Vivian. Of course she had. A network of household informants who had been feeding her information for 8 months would certainly include someone capable of relaying the night's events by morning. She knew the child had come early. She knew Vivian had survived. And her response was this: 4 sentences calibrated to be concerned without being alarmed, warm without being presumptuous, patient in the way of someone who expects to wait and has no doubt about the outcome. "I'll be here when things settle," as though this were a temporary disruption, as though Damien's life were a schedule that had been inconveniently rearranged and would return, in due time, to its prior configuration. He set the letter down. He picked up a pen. He was very still for a moment. Then he wrote a different message, not to Celine, but to Lord Ashby, whose villa it was. He required a complete list of every guest who had stayed at the Ashby estate in the past year. He required it with the authority of the Blackthorn title behind it, which meant he required it by tomorrow, and what he intended to do with the information thereafter was his own business. He sent 3 more letters before evening, 2 to men in London whose usefulness lay in their access to information that moved in spaces Damien could not reach directly. 1 to his solicitor, framed as a general inquiry into the legal dimensions of correspondence interference and household employment law, which was both technically accurate and entirely insufficient to describe what he had in mind. At 6 o'clock, Mrs. Harrow appeared in the study doorway with the list he had requested. 4 names: Ellis and 3 others, a parlour-maid, an under-footman, and the household's external messenger, who had been routing Vivian's outgoing letters through a redirected address for the past 7 months. Damien read the list. He folded it once and put it in the desk drawer and locked the drawer. "All 4 are confined to quarters," Mrs. Harrow said. "I've told them nothing except that His Grace wishes to speak with them at his convenience." "Good. The physician has been again to see Her Grace and the young lord." A pause. "She's asked that you not be sent for unless she requests it." He absorbed this without changing his expression. That was its own kind of discipline. The ability to absorb things without the face giving a receipt. He had cultivated it over 20 years of managing men who looked for weakness in the hinge points, who watched eyes and jawlines and the slight tension around a mouth for anything they could use. "Is she well enough to have that be her choice?" he said. "She is well enough," Mrs. Harrow said, "that Dr. Pemberton believes the crisis has passed. And yes, I believe it is her choice." He nodded once. Mrs. Harrow moved to leave, stopped at the door. "Your Grace." Her voice was different, not the report voice, not the housekeeper's professional register. Something older than that. Something she had clearly decided to say and had been sitting on all day. "I have worked in this house for 22 years. I worked for your father. I have seen a great many things that were not my business to speak about, and I kept that boundary because it was appropriate." She looked at him. "This is outside that boundary. What happened last night, what she went through alone in this house, that is a debt, Your Grace, not a mistake, a debt. And she knows the difference." The room was very quiet. "I know," Damien said. She left. He sat at the desk until the light was entirely gone from the windows. Well, Vivian was not asleep when he came to her door. She knew it was him from the footstep. She had always known his step, the specific weight and rhythm of it, the way it had never quite matched the careful, considerate movement of a man trying not to impose. Damien Blackthorne walked through his own house the way he moved through everything, as though it were already his, because it was, and there was no point in pretending otherwise. She heard him stop outside the door. She said nothing. After a moment, his voice came through the wood, low and even. "I'm not coming in. I just want you to know I'm here." She looked at the ceiling. The candle on the nightstand was burning low and needed replacing, and she had been too tired to ring for it and too stubborn to admit she was too tired. Outside, the moors were dark, and the storm's aftermath had left the air clean in the particular sharp way of November after rain, the kind of clean that almost made up for the cold. From the nursery down the hall, she could not hear Edward, which meant Greta had managed to settle him, which was more than she had managed to do in the first hour after the midwife left. "I found the letters," he said through the door. "All of them. And I found the man who intercepted them. I know where this started, and I know whose hand is in it." She did not answer. "I'm not telling you this to—" A pause. The kind that meant he was choosing words, which was unusual for him. "I'm not telling you to negotiate something. I just don't want you to think you were imagining it. The letters. The silence. None of that was me choosing it." Vivian closed her eyes. She was 32 hours past nearly dying. Her body felt like something had been taken from it and put back in a slightly different arrangement, functional, but aware of every component in a way that was new and exhausting. She was not angry at him in this moment. She was past the place where anger lived. Anger required a certain kind of energy, a certain residual investment in the outcome, and she had spent so much of herself in the last 2 days that what remained was something quieter and more final. She believed him about the letters. That was the thing she couldn't quite resolve. She believed him about the letters, and it changed nothing, because the letters had been intercepted for 8 months, and in 8 months he had not noticed the silence, had not pulled at the thread of a wife who had stopped seeming to need him, had not wondered why a woman who had written to him twice a week for 2 years had apparently gone quiet. He had accepted the quiet the way a man accepts something convenient, without examination, without asking why the ground underfoot had become so smooth. The door opened. She hadn't said, "Come in." He came in anyway. She opened her eyes. He was standing just inside the threshold, not advancing, as though he had calculated the exact distance that constituted entry without encroachment. He looked different. She had looked at this man for 2 years, and she knew his faces the way you know terrain you've crossed repeatedly, and this face was not one she had seen before. He looked tired in a way that went deeper than a missed night of sleep, and there was something around his eyes that she did not want to name because naming it would cost her something she needed to hold on to. "I told you not to come in," she said. "I know." "Then why?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because I needed to see that you were all right. I needed to see it myself." "I'm alive," she said, the words flat and precise. "That's as far as I can get right now." "I know." "Do you?" She shifted against the pillows, too tired for the careful management of tone she usually employed around him. "Because you said the same thing in the corridor this morning, and I've been trying to figure out since then what exactly it is you think you know. You know I almost died. You know Edward is small. You know someone in your household has been managing your correspondence for 8 months. She looked at him directly. "Do you know what it was like to be in this room last night without you? Not in the abstract. Do you know what that actually was?" He held her gaze. He did not look away, which she noted, because there were things he had looked away from before. "No," he said. "I don't, and I'm not going to pretend I do." "That's the first honest thing you've said to me in longer than last night." The candle guttered. Neither of them moved to address it. "I'm going to deal with this," Damien said. "Celine, the staff, all of it. I'm going to dismantle every part of what she built in this house, and I'm going to make certain nothing like this." "Damien!" Her voice stopped him the way a wall stops forward motion. "I don't care about Celine right now." He waited. "I care about the fact that you were 30 miles from here, and a rider reached you, and you said you would come in the morning." Each word landed separately. "I care about the fact that even without the intercepted letters, without Lady Whitmore's interference, you still chose to wait until morning. That choice was yours. No one managed that one." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before it. Those had been comfortable silences, silences he had occupied without noticing. This one had weight. This one was alive with something that both of them could feel, but only one of them had the vocabulary to name. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. "I can't defend it," he said. "I'm not going to try." Something moved through her face, not forgiveness. She was nowhere near that country yet. But something. The slight shift of someone who has braced against an incoming denial and found instead an open hand, and doesn't yet trust what that means. "Go," she said. "Edward will need feeding again in 2 hours, and I want to sleep before then." He went. But at the door he stopped, and she knew he had stopped before he spoke, because there was a quality to his stillness she recognized. The stillness of a man arriving at something he did not have a prepared position for. "I went through the letters," he said, not turning around. "All 5 of them, the real ones. The ones Celine's man was holding." A pause. "You wrote to me in the 3rd one that you were frightened, that the physician was concerned and you were frightened and you wanted me home." Another pause. "I didn't know you were frightened. In 2 years, I had never heard you say that." Vivian said nothing. "I should have," he said. "I should have known." He left. She lay in the dark with the guttering candle and the clean, cold air from the moors, and her son sleeping down the hall with his small chest working for each breath. And she stared at the ceiling, and she felt the thing she had been holding very carefully since the night before begin to develop a crack in it. Small, hairline, the kind of crack that does not immediately compromise a structure and yet cannot be unfelt once you know it's there. She pressed her hand against her sternum. She was not going to forgive him because he had said the right thing once. She was not built that way, and she had no intention of being rebuilt. But she was, against her will, against the deliberate fortification of the last 30 hours, beginning to understand that the man who had come in through that door was not the same man who had remained at a lakeside villa while she bled. Something had broken in him too, somewhere in the hours since morning. She did not know yet whether broken things could be made useful. Down the hall, Edward made his small, questioning sound, and she pressed the call for Greta, and she turned onto her side and she closed her eyes. She did not sleep. In a room she could not see, in a house 30 miles away, a woman named Celine Whitmore received the second message from Blackthorn Estate that day. Not from Damien, but from the last informant she had not yet been informed was compromised, and read it twice and set it down, and looked out at the dark lake with the expression of someone revising a plan they had thought was finished. The revision was not small. She had not accounted for Vivian's surviving. Celine Whitmore had not survived 36 years in English aristocracy by being careless. She had survived it by understanding one thing that most people in her position refuse to understand, that the moment you stop planning for the worst outcome stopped being a contingency and became a schedule. She had grown up watching women of her class treat security as something that arrived on its own, through the right marriage, the right alliance, the right set of circumstances aligning at the right time. And she had watched those same women dismantled, one by one, when the circumstances shifted. She had decided at 17 that she would not be dismantled. She had been working toward that decision every day since. The message from Blackthorn had arrived at 9:30 in the evening, not from Damien. That was the first wrong note. In 8 months of managed correspondence, every message that moved between the villa and the estate had carried either Damien's hand or the neutral administrative language of household staff relaying his instructions. This message came from a different hand entirely, cramped, hurried, the writing of someone who had composed it quickly and under pressure. It was also unsigned, which meant whoever sent it was already uncertain whether they would be in a position to claim authorship. 4 names given. Ellis and 3 others confined. His Grace knows the source. You should leave before morning. Celine read it, set it down on the table beside the window, picked it up and read it again. She was not panicking. Panic was a young person's response to information, the response of someone who had not yet learned that information was only useful when you held still long enough to read it correctly. What she felt instead was something colder and more precise. The sensation of a plan encountering friction, the need to reassess load-bearing structures and identify which ones could bear additional weight. Ellis was gone. She had expected Ellis might eventually become a problem. He was a man of ordinary intelligence and extraordinary debt, and those 2 qualities in combination produced a ceiling on reliability. She had not expected him to go this quickly, but she had built for it. Ellis knew only his own piece of the mechanism. He could give Damien names. He could confirm 8 months of managed correspondence. He could not tell Damien the full scope of what she had constructed, because Ellis had never been given that view. The question was what Damien had already figured out independently. She looked out at the lake. The water was black and perfectly still, and the night air had the specific clarity of late autumn, each star shockingly precise. Beautiful. The way things are beautiful when you're looking at them through the lens of a decision you haven't made yet. She had not accounted for Vivian surviving. That was the honest assessment. The physicians had been concerned. She had a contact, a different contact, not in the household but adjacent to it, who had confirmed the early labor was dangerous, the blood loss significant. Celine had calculated a range of outcomes and weighted them accordingly, and in the weighted range, the probability that Vivian Blackthorne would be a functioning obstacle 36 hours after an emergency premature delivery had been low. The probability had been wrong. She began to compose. Not letters, not yet. She began at the desk beside the dark lake to compose the next version of the plan, the version that operated without Ellis, without the household network, without the quiet infrastructure she had spent 8 months building. She had done more with less before. She had built her entire position in English society out of less. What she had now that she had not had at 17 was access to rooms, to conversations, to men who owed her in the specific, careful ways that men accumulate debts when they think no one is keeping records. She had letters of her own, not intercepted ones. Letters written to her by men who had trusted her with information they should have protected, who had said things in the particular looseness of intimate confidence that had seemed reasonable at the time and would look catastrophic on paper. Among those letters was a recent one from Damien, not romantic. She had been careful about that. Damien was a man who kept physical distance precisely because he understood that proximity was a form of commitment, and Celine had respected that instinct because crossing it prematurely would have ended everything. The letter was instead something more useful. Damien, in a moment of frustration with the political situation in London, had written to her about certain financial arrangements that were not intended for general knowledge, arrangements involving 2 other powerful families, a parliamentary vote, and a sum of money that moved through 3 intermediary accounts before reaching its destination. On its own, the letter proved nothing criminal. In the right hands, framed correctly, delivered at the right moment, it could end him. She did not want to use it. She wanted, still, the outcome she had been building toward. Damien's confidence, Damien's proximity, and in time, the position that proximity implied. The letter was a last resort. Last resorts had a way of becoming first resorts once you pulled them out, and she understood that using it would mean choosing a different kind of victory than the one she had planned. She closed her fingers around the pen. Not yet. She would give herself until morning to see how the situation developed before she decided whether she was playing offense or defense. She did not sleep. Damien left for London on the 4th day. Not for Celine. He had not gone back to the villa, had not sent another message, had not so much as spoken her name since the corridor conversation with Mrs. Harrow. He went to London because 2 of the men he had written to had responded with information that required a face-to-face conversation, the kind of conversation that could not happen by letter and should not happen with any intermediary present. He told Vivian before he left. She was in the sitting room adjacent to her chamber. The first day she had been permitted out of bed on Dr. Pemberton's cautious authorization, in a chair by the window with Edward in her arms and the particular expression of exhausted vigilance she had worn continuously since the birth. The baby was awake, which still surprised Damien slightly every time, the fact of his being awake and present and opinionated about it in his small, wordless way. London, Vivian said. 2 days, 3 at most. She looked at him. He had learned in 4 days that she had approximately 6 different ways of looking at him, and they were all distinct, and he was still mapping them. This one was the look that was withholding judgment while collecting information. The men I wrote to have something, he said. I need to see it in person. Related to Celine. Yes. She looked back at Edward, adjusted the blanket with a practiced efficiency that 4 days of new motherhood had apparently produced from nothing. And when you have what they have, she said, what exactly do you intend to do with it? Expose her, publicly, if necessary, completely. At what cost to you? He paused. The fact that you paused, she said, still looking at the baby, tells me there's a cost. There's always a cost. I'll manage it. You'll manage it, she repeated flatly, in the tone of someone who has heard this sentence before and knows its track record. And if the managing requires things that make everything worse before they get better, Vivian, I am a person in this situation, Damien, not a room you leave and come back to. I would like to be consulted on things that will affect my life and my son's life before they are decided. The room was very quiet. He had not, he realized, been thinking of it that way. He had been thinking of it as his problem to solve, his failure, his mistake, his network of consequences to dismantle. He had been operating in the mode he always operated in. Identify the threat, assess the resources, execute. The fact that the threat had grown in the soil of his marriage, and that his marriage contained a person who had standing opinions about the growing and the dismantling, had not been fully integrated into his planning. You're right, he said, for the second time in 4 days. It was getting easier, which seemed wrong, but he did not examine that. Tell me what you know, she said. He told her. Not everything. There were pieces he was still assembling, but the structure of it. 8 months of interference. Ellis and the 3 others now dismissed without reference. The redirected outgoing letters. Celine's presence at every location Damien had occupied for the past year. The pattern of it. The logistics of it. How it would have required a level of prior planning that preceded their meeting. Vivian listened without interrupting. The baby slept against her chest. She was planning this before she met you, Vivian said when he finished. Yes. So you were the target specifically, not just an opportunity. My title, my seat, my political position, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Edward made a small sound and she moved automatically, the adjustment so reflexive it looked like breathing. She studied you, she said. She knew how you operated, what you responded to, what you were willing to ignore. A pause. She was right about that last part. He absorbed this. Yes. I'm not saying that to wound you. I'm saying it because if you go to London and expose her without understanding that she studied you, she will have a contingency for whatever you bring. She'll have anticipated it. He looked at her. She was looking at the window now, at the gray November moors with the expression of someone thinking several steps ahead of where they were standing. He had married this woman and spent 2 years treating her as peripheral, as present but not particularly load-bearing, and in 4 days of crisis she had demonstrated a mind that operated in the same register he operated in, only quieter and therefore invisible until she chose to deploy it. What would you do? He said. I would find out what she has on you, Vivian said, before I moved against her, because she will have something. A woman who plans 8 months in advance does not walk into an exposure without a prepared response. London. 2 days. He had already been planning to ask the right questions, but she had sharpened the question. Not just what Celine had done, but what Celine was holding. I'll be back in 3 days, he said. Vivian nodded once. Then, without looking at him, be careful. It was not warmth. It was something more provisional than warmth. But it was real, and it was directed at him, and he held on to it for the entire 4-hour ride to London in the way a man holds on to something he is not sure he deserves, but is not yet willing to put down. Oas. The first meeting was with a man named Greville, who operated at the intersection of political intelligence and aristocratic gossip in the way that certain men in London specialized in, knowing which of those 2 categories any given piece of information actually belonged to, and charging accordingly for the distinction. Greville had 3 things for him. The first was a guest record. Lady Celine Whitmore had stayed at the Ashby Villa 9 times in the past 14 months, twice before Damien had ever been there. She had been there first. She had established herself in Ashby's social orbit with the specific patience of someone laying groundwork. And when Damien began using the villa for his own purposes, she was already there. The second thing was a name. A solicitor in Gray's Inn who had been conducting what appeared to be background research into the Blackthorn estate and its financial arrangements for approximately 10 months. Not Celine's solicitor of record. A different man, paid through an intermediary, producing reports that had been delivered to a postal address that resolved through 3 degrees of separation to a property in Celine's name. She had been studying the estate. Not just Damien, the estate, the finances, the entailments, the vulnerabilities in the inheritance structure. Damien sat across from Greville in a private room in a private club and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt it in his sternum, a cold and very specific pressure, the feeling of recognizing that the ground under his feet was less solid than he had been assuming. The third thing Greville had was the part that changed the temperature of the room. "There's a letter," Greville said. He had a careful face, the kind built for delivering information without absorbing any of the reaction. "I became aware of it through a secondary channel. It appears to be in your hand, Your Grace, directed to Lady Whitmore, written approximately 6 weeks ago. The content as described to me involves financial arrangements relating to the Pemberton Bill." He paused. "The secondary channel suggests she is prepared to use it." Damien was still. The Pemberton Bill. A parliamentary vote 3 months prior, one that had affected the tax arrangements of 4 major estates, including Blackthorn. The financial movement Greville was referring to was legal in structure and deeply compromising in appearance, money that had moved to influence the outcome of a vote, through channels that were opaque by design. Damien had written the letter in a moment of frankness that he had not considered risky, because he had believed he was writing to a woman he could trust with frankness. He had been wrong. "She hasn't used it yet," Greville said. "Because she still wants the other outcome," Damien said. His voice was even. He could feel his own pulse in a way that was unusual. "She'd rather have the position. The letter is insurance." "That's my read as well." He looked at the table. There was a glass of brandy in front of him that he had not touched, and he looked at it now with the mild abstraction of a man whose mind is moving faster than his face. He had walked into London thinking he was the hunter. The letter meant he was also the prey, had been for weeks. Celine had constructed a position that worked in either direction. If Damien came back to her willingly, she had what she wanted. If he moved against her, she had leverage sufficient to destroy what he was trying to protect. He thought of Vivian's voice. "Find out what she has on you before you move against her." She had known. Not the specifics. She couldn't have known the specifics. But she had known the shape of it, the logic of it, the way a woman who plans 8 months in advance does not reach the end of the plan without a weapon for every contingency. He rode back to Blackthorn the next morning instead of staying for the second meeting. He found Vivian in the nursery. She was standing over the cradle with her back to the door, and she did not turn when he came in because she had already heard his step in the corridor and had been waiting for it. Edward was awake, doing his small, effortful breathing, his hands working at nothing. "That was fast," she said. "I have what I need." "And?" He came to stand beside her. They both looked at the baby for a moment, this strange new fact of their shared life, this small person who had arrived too early into a marriage that had not been ready for him and somehow persisted regardless. "She has a letter," he said, "from me. It involves the Pemberton vote." Vivian was quiet. Then, "How bad?" "Bad enough that if it surfaces in the wrong hands at the wrong moment, it ends my seat and possibly my freedom." The nursery was warm. Greta was elsewhere. Outside the window, the afternoon light was thin and very clean, the light of a November day that had decided to make an effort. "She's going to use it," Vivian said. Not a question. Not if she still thinks she can get the other thing she wants. "Which is you?" "Which is this?" He gestured slightly. The house, the title, what it all represented. "Me is just the mechanism." Vivian turned to look at him. He met her eyes. Hers were gray and steady and doing that thing they did now, the thing they had started doing since the night of the storm. That assessment, that weighing, the measuring of the distance between what he said and what was true. "If you expose her," she said slowly, "she releases the letter. If you don't expose her, she has permanent leverage over you. And over this family." She looked back at Edward. "That's the position she's built." "Yes." "Which means the only way out is to find the letter before she uses it, or make it irrelevant." "The first is difficult. I don't know where she's keeping it." "And the second?" He was quiet for a moment. Making something irrelevant meant getting in front of it, disclosing it on his own terms, to the right people, framed correctly, before she could deliver it as a weapon. It meant a controlled demolition of something he had spent years building, accepting a smaller loss to prevent a larger one. It was the kind of decision that required a particular capacity for self-overruling that he had never previously needed to develop. "The second is possible," he said. Vivian said nothing. "It would mean going to Lord Harcastle before she can reach him, telling him myself. The arrangements, the letter, all of it." Hardcastle was the senior political figure most implicated by the Pemberton vote, the man with the most to lose, and therefore the most incentive to help manage the exposure. It would cost something, but it would take the weapon out of her hands. He felt Vivian looking at him, really looking. "You'd have to be honest," she said. Her voice had a quality he couldn't immediately classify. "Not managed, not strategic, actually honest." "Yes." "About something that exposes you." "Yes." "You've never done that." The words were not cruel. They were simply accurate, delivered in the flat, clear register of someone who has been observing a person for 2 years and is now reporting what they saw. "No," he said. "I haven't." The baby made his small sound. The afternoon light moved slightly as a cloud passed. Somewhere in the house a door opened and closed. "Then do it," Vivian said. He looked at her. "Because the alternative is spending the rest of your life being managed by a woman who studied you and found all the places where you won't look." She held his gaze. "And I will not raise my son in a house that is owned by someone else's leverage." It was not a declaration of solidarity. It was not forgiveness or warmth or any of the things he might have wanted it to be. It was Vivian Blackthorne drawing a line in the ground and telling him which side of it she intended to stand on. For Edward, for the house, for the future she was going to build regardless of what he decided, and telling him with perfect clarity what it would take for him to stand beside her. He had to change something fundamental. Not tactics, not approach, something underneath. "All right," he said. From downstairs at that moment came the sound that unmade everything. Mrs. Harrow's voice, controlled, rapid, carrying the particular compression of a woman delivering news she had been hoping not to deliver, came up through the floor of the nursery as she spoke to someone in the entrance hall below. And then another voice, a woman's voice, unhurried, assured, carrying the specific confidence of someone who had rehearsed their arrival. Celine Whitmore was in the house. She had not waited for morning. Damien was already moving before Vivian spoke. Not toward the stairs, toward Edward. He crossed the nursery in 4 steps and lifted his son from the cradle with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, and he turned and held the child out to Vivian with the specific deliberateness of a man transferring something irreplaceable to the only person he trusted with it. Vivian took him. She didn't ask why. She had already heard the voice from downstairs, and her face had already done the thing it did, gone still, gone internal, the calm that wasn't calm, but was its functional equivalent, the face of a woman who had learned to process threat without showing it. "Stay here," Damien said. "Don't tell me to stay here." "Vivian, I am 5 days past nearly dying in this house." Her voice was quiet and absolutely inflexible. "I am not going to sit in the nursery while that woman is in my entrance hall." He looked at her. Edward breathed against her chest, small and steady and present. He thought of all the arguments available to him, her health, the physician's instructions, the advantage of controlling the encounter without her present, and understood, in the time it took to think them, that none of them would work and none of them should. She had as much standing in this house as he did. More, by some measures, he was only beginning to properly calculate. "Then give me 30 seconds, he said. "Let me get downstairs first." She nodded once. He went. Celine was in the entrance hall. She was dressed for travel, which meant she had come directly. No villa stop, no intermediate arrangement. She was standing near the center of the hall with the posture of a woman who has arrived somewhere she expects to be received and is prepared to wait for that expectation to be met. Mrs. Harrow was near the door with her hands folded and her expression doing the thing it did when she was managing something she deeply disapproved of, radiating contained disapproval through pure stillness. 2 servants flanked the entrance. They were looking at anything that wasn't the woman in the center of the room. Celine saw Damien reach the bottom of the stairs, and her face did something that was almost a smile. Almost. It was the expression of someone who has rehearsed a range of opening positions and is selecting the most appropriate one in real time. "Damien," she said, warm, unhurried, the tone of a woman arriving at a social engagement, not a confrontation. "I came as soon as I could. I heard about Vivian, about the child. I wanted to offer my support in person." He stopped at the foot of the stairs. He had known this woman for 8 months. He had sat across from her at tables, ridden beside her on country lanes, stood at windows in rented villas talking about things he had mistaken for honesty. He had believed she found him interesting. He had believed it was simple, desire or ambition in its ordinary, manageable form, the kind of thing that every man in his position navigated regularly and filed under known risks. He understood now that he had been looking at a clock and believing it was a mirror. "Mrs. Harrow," he said, without taking his eyes off Celine. "Leave us." "Mrs. Harrow hesitated one fraction of a second, just long enough to register that she wanted to argue, and then left. The two servants followed. The entrance hall went quiet with the specific quality of a space that has been recently vacated and is aware of what remains. "You look tired," Celine said. Her voice had adjusted slightly, more intimate now, calibrated for the reduced audience. "This has been a terrible week for you. For both of you, I imagine. How is she?" "She's recovering." "And the child?" "Recovering." "That's a relief." She moved toward the sitting room door, not waiting for an invitation, moving with the practiced naturalness of someone who has mapped a space and knows where the center of gravity lies. "Can we sit?" "No," Damien said. She stopped, turned. The almost smile remained, but something behind it had shifted, recalibrated, adjusting to new data. "You came here for a reason," he said. "We can address it here." She looked at him for a moment. The warmth did not leave her face. It was too structurally embedded to leave quickly. But behind it something colder surfaced, like a stone made visible by a drop in water level. "I came," she said carefully, "because I was concerned about you, about the situation, about what might be said and by whom before you and I had a chance to speak." "You came because Greville talked." A pause. Fractional. Gone in under a second. But he saw it. "I don't know He told me about the letter," Damien said. "The one in my hand regarding the Pemberton vote. He told me you have it, that you've been holding it, and that you're prepared to use it." He watched her face. "So we can skip the concern. What is it you actually want?" The entrance hall was cold. November had gotten into the stone again, the permanent seep of it. Somewhere above them, distant, barely audible, Edward made his small sound, and then went quiet. Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then, with the ease of a woman removing a mask she had finished kneading, the warmth left her face entirely. What replaced it was not cruelty. It was something more unsettling than cruelty. The focused, impersonal attention of someone who has been working toward a specific outcome for a long time and is now simply managing the final steps. "What I want," she said, "is what I've always wanted. I want a position that is secure, influence that is real, a seat at the table where decisions actually happen." She tilted her head slightly. "I don't particularly need a husband. I need a partnership with someone who has the title and the political weight to make everything I bring to the arrangement functional. I thought I had communicated that clearly." "You communicated it through 8 months of manipulated correspondence and a nearly fatal childbirth." "I communicated it through a series of reasonable arrangements that kept a situation stable while I assessed whether you were capable of the kind of partnership I described." Her voice was even. "The childbirth was not something I arranged. I arranged for you to be away. What happened to Vivian was a consequence of prematurity, not of anything I did. You kept me away from my wife while she bled." "You were away," she said, "because you chose to be there. I provided an invitation. You accepted it, every time." A pause. "That's the part that bothers you most, isn't it? Not what I did, what you made easy." The words landed with the accuracy of something aimed. He felt them land, felt the specific truth in them, the edge that was most effective precisely because it was not entirely wrong. She was good. He had known she was good. What he had not understood until now was that her particular skill was not manipulation in the ordinary sense, but something more refined, the ability to locate a man's existing inclinations and create conditions in which he followed them to her preferred destination, so that afterward he could not point to any single moment of being forced. It required a target who was already moving in a useful direction. He had been moving in a useful direction. "The letter," he said, "is in a safe place. I want it back." "I imagine you do." "Name a price." She smiled. A real one this time. The first real expression he had seen from her in 8 months, possibly longer. That's not how this works, Damien. The letter isn't a commodity, it's the foundation of a conversation. What I'd like to have is an honest conversation about what this arrangement could look like, going forward, with everything on the table. There is no arrangement, he said. There is no going forward. You are in my house without an invitation, and you are leaving. I'm leaving, she agreed pleasantly, when we've concluded our conversation. I have no interest in prolonged conflict. I have interest in a functional outcome. She looked at him steadily. Vivian nearly died. Your son is fragile. You are holding a political position that depends on the Pemberton arrangements remaining private. These are your realities. I am not your enemy unless you decide I am. You are my enemy, he said, because you made a choice 8 months ago that treated my wife and child as acceptable losses. Something moved through her face. Not guilt. It was too unfamiliar a terrain for guilt. Something closer to impatience. The impatience of a person who has assigned a low priority to a consideration that someone else is insisting on weighting heavily. Your wife is alive, Celine said. The temperature of the room dropped approximately 4 degrees. Damien did not respond. He was very still in the way he went still when something crossed a line he had not previously known the location of. He could feel his pulse in his hands, in the back of his jaw, in the specific cold clarity that arrived when he stopped managing his reaction and simply let the reaction be what it was. He was not a man who lost his temper. He was a man who became, when pushed past a certain point, something quieter and considerably more dangerous than anger. Your wife is alive, Celine repeated, not reading the stillness correctly, or reading it and deciding to push through it. And your son is alive, and the Pemberton arrangements are private, and all of that can remain true. I'm offering you a way to keep it all intact. I'm offering you— Get out of my house, the voice from the stairs. Vivian. She was on the landing, not at the bottom, not fully descended, but visible, present, holding Edward against her chest with one arm and gripping the banister with her other hand in the way of someone who has been instructed not to exert herself and has decided that instruction is inapplicable to present circumstances. She was in her day clothes, the first time since the birth, and she was pale in the way she had been pale for 5 days, the pallor of someone who has spent significant blood and not yet fully replaced it. She looked at Celine with an expression that had nothing in it that needed translating. Celine looked up at her. Something shifted in her face. A recalculation, rapid, the brief visible effort of integrating new data. She had built her plan around a Vivian who was peripheral, who was managed out of the picture by her own husband's absence. The Vivian on the stairs, holding her son with 5-day-old hands that did not shake, looking down at her with eyes the color of storm water, was not that Vivian. She had miscalculated. She was understanding this in real time. Vivian, Celine said, and the warmth attempted to return. I'm so glad you kept my husband 30 miles from this house while I nearly died. Vivian's voice was level, lower than usual. The level of it was worse than volume would have been. You paid servants in my home to intercept my letters. You planned this, not as an accident, not as a consequence, but as a deliberate strategy, and now you are standing in my entrance hall discussing arrangements. A pause. I am 5 days past a premature labor with significant blood loss. I have not slept more than 3 hours in a row. I am in no condition to be gracious. Another pause. Get out. Celine was quiet for a moment. She looked at Vivian, then at Damien, then back at Vivian with the expression of a woman revising her model of the situation at significant speed. The letter, she started. Use it, Vivian said. Damien looked at his wife. Use it, she said again, still looking at Celine. Release it. Send it to whoever you think will do the most damage with it. Because my husband is going to Lord Harcastle this week, and he is going to disclose every arrangement in it himself, on his own terms before you can. She shifted Edward slightly against her chest. You built a position that depends on Damien being afraid of exposure. He is going to remove that foundation, and when he does, the letter is worthless. A pause. So use it now if you're going to. It won't matter by Friday. The entrance hall was perfectly silent. Celine looked at Vivian for a long moment. The calculation behind her eyes was visible now in a way it had never been. The mask fully gone, the actual machinery running in plain view. She was looking at a woman she had dismissed as a variable and discovering she was a load-bearing wall. Damien had not known Vivian was going to say that. She had not consulted him. She had come down the stairs with 5-day-old legs and stood on his landing and called Celine's fundamental position, the letter, as leverage, and staked the entire game on his willingness to do what he had said he would do, on his honesty. On the change she had told him had to be real and not strategic. He had told her he would go to Hardcastle. He had meant it when he said it. She was betting everything on the difference between meaning something and doing it. He looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was watching Celine, her face still, her arm around Edward, her knuckles on the banister the only visible evidence of the physical cost of standing there. She had not looked at him because she did not need confirmation. She had already decided whether she believed him. "I'll see myself out," Celine said. Her voice was even. Whatever she was feeling, recalculation, fury, the particular cold of a plan meeting its first genuine obstruction, none of it reached her voice. She was too disciplined for that. She moved toward the door, unhurried, and she stopped with her hand on the latch, and she looked back at Damien with an expression that was not defeat, and was not a threat, and was something in between. "She nearly died," Celine said quietly. "And you were at my window. That's not something you fix with a trip to Hardcastle." She looked at him for one more second. "But I suppose you know that." She opened the door. The November air came through in a cold, clean gust that moved through the entire entrance hall and reached the stairs, and reached Vivian, and reached Edward's blanket, and moved it slightly. Celine Whitmore walked out of Blackthorn and closed the door. The latch clicked. The hall went absolutely still. Damien stood at the foot of the stairs. He looked up at his wife. She was looking at the door. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were too bright, and her hand on the banister had tightened until the knuckles had gone white, and he understood that what had held her upright on those stairs through that entire conversation had been will and nothing else, that the body doing the holding was 5 days past catastrophe, and that it was now, with the door closed and Celine gone, beginning to register the cost. He went up the stairs. She did not say anything. He reached the landing, and he took Edward from her with one arm, his son, who weighed almost nothing and required everything. And with his other hand he caught her elbow, because she was not going to ask for the support, and she needed it. She let him. That was the thing that unmade him slightly. She let him. They stood on the landing for a moment, both of them, in the silence of the house with the cold still fading from the entrance hall below, and Edward breathed his small, effortful breaths between them. "Hardcastle," Vivian said. "Friday," he said. "I'll leave Friday." She nodded. She straightened her arm, gently, not pulling away, just finding her own balance again, reasserting it. She looked at Edward's face, at the particular concentration of his sleeping expression, the small furrow between his brows that looked almost adult. She was right about one thing, Vivian said. She did not look at Damien when she said it. He waited. "You were at her window. She said it the way you say something that has been sitting in the room with you for days and has finally used up all its patience. Not because she put you there, because some part of you chose to be somewhere you didn't have to think about what was happening here." She was quiet for a moment. "That part is the thing that has to change. Not the letter, not Celine. That part." He had nothing to offer in response that wasn't insufficient. "I know," he said. She turned toward the nursery. He walked beside her, carrying Edward, the three of them moving through the corridor in the particular quiet of people who have survived something together and not yet determined what that survival means for whatever comes next. He would go to Hardcastle Friday. He would sit across from the most powerful political figure in his circle, and he would disclose, without preparation or management, the full contents of the Pemberton arrangements, and he would accept whatever followed. Not because it was strategic, because Vivian had stood on those stairs on 5-day-old legs and staked her entire gamble on his capacity to be honest, and he would not make her wrong. He laid Edward in the cradle. The baby stirred, frowned, settled. Behind him, Vivian sat in the chair by the window. The afternoon light was going à poire. The short days of November, the dark arriving earlier every evening. She looked out at the moors. "There's something else," she said, something in her voice. He turned. Her face was still directed at the window. The light was on her profile, and in that light, thin and honest and unsparing, he could see how much the last 5 days had cost her, how much the last 5 minutes had cost her, and beneath that, something else, a new quality, recently arrived, that hadn't been there before, a kind of determination that was not the same as her ordinary resolve. This had a different shape, harder at the edges, less negotiable. I received a letter this morning, she said, before you came back from London. I wasn't going to tell you until after Celine. He waited. It's from my sister. She turned from the window. Her eyes met his. Charlotte is in London. She's been speaking to people in Celine's circle. She says Celine has been circulating a different story. Not the Pemberton letter, something else. She held his gaze. She has been telling certain people in London society that Edward is not your son. The floor did not move. The walls did not move. The nursery was perfectly still, the candle on the table burning without flicker, Edward in the cradle breathing his small, steady breaths. Damien stood in the silence of the room and understood that the confrontation he had thought was finished had not finished, had not even fully begun. Celine had been in this house 20 minutes ago. She had walked out calmly, without the letter weaponized, without her position secured, having lost the encounter by every visible metric. And she had already been burning a different fire. The letter was a retreat. This was the real weapon. Not his political exposure, but Vivian's honor, Edward's legitimacy. The one wound that had no administrative solution, that could not be addressed with a trip to Hardcastle, that would live in the drawing rooms of London regardless of what any document said, because society did not require proof for the stories it chose to keep. He looked at his son. Edward breathed. In and out. Steady, small, real. How far has it spread? Damien said. Vivian's voice when she answered was the steadiest thing in the room. Far enough, she said, that Charlotte heard it from 3 separate sources before she wrote to me. A pause. There is a winter ball in 6 weeks. Lord and Lady Pemberton's estate. Every significant family in England will be there. She looked at him. Celine will be there. 6 weeks. The ball. Every significant family in England, and a story already moving through the invisible arterial network of their world, carried on breath and whispered between measured sips of wine, growing the way those stories always grew, gathering detail it had never possessed, acquiring certainty it had never earned. Damien understood, standing over his son's cradle in the thin November light, that everything he had done this week, the confrontation, the planning, the willingness to go to Hardcastle, had been the preparation for a fight he had not yet entered. The real fight was 6 weeks away, in a ballroom full of people who had already been handed a story, with a woman who had anticipated every move except the one he hadn't made yet, because he did not yet know what that move was. This is a work of complete fiction created for entertainment purposes only. All characters, events, and situations depicted are entirely imaginary. 6 weeks is a long time when you are learning to be a different person. Damien understood this in the way you understand things that have no theoretical dimension, not as a concept, but as a daily physical fact, the way hunger is a fact, the way cold is a fact. Every morning he woke before the house and went to the nursery and stood over Edward's cradle for 10 minutes in the dark, listening to him breathe, and every morning the breathing was slightly stronger than the morning before. And every morning Damien thought about what it meant that this was now the first thing he needed. Not correspondence, not the day's political arrangements, not any of the machinery of power he had spent 20 years maintaining. This, the sound of his son's chest working. He went to Hardcastle on a Friday, as promised. He sat in the man's study in London, and he laid the Pemberton arrangements on the table, and he explained them without management or preparation, in plain language that left no interpretive exits. Hardcastle listened with the expression of a man receiving information he has suspected for some time and had hoped would organize itself without his direct involvement. When Damien finished, Hardcastle was quiet for a long moment. "You're getting ahead of something," Hardcastle said. "Yes." "A letter." "Yes." Hardcastle looked at the papers on the table. He was 62 years old and had survived 5 administrations by understanding precisely when a controlled exposure was preferable to an uncontrolled one. He picked up the papers, read them once more, and set them down. "I'll need 2 weeks to manage the framing," he said. "If this surfaces on my terms and yours simultaneously, it's a financial irregularity. If it surfaces on someone else's terms, it's a scandal." He looked at Damien steadily. "You understand the difference?" "Yes." "And the woman with the letter?" "I'll handle her." Hardcastle nodded once, with the crisp finality of a man closing a door on a room he does not intend to revisit. "Then we understand each other." Damien rode back to Blackthorn the same evening. He walked into the house at 10 o'clock, handed off his coat, and went directly to Vivian's sitting room, where she was awake by the fire with a book she was not reading and Edward in the cradle beside her chair. She had taken to keeping him close in the evenings, a decision that had nothing to do with medical necessity and everything to do with something more primary than that. He sat in the chair across from her, and he told her everything Hardcastle had said, every word, without selecting which parts were useful for her to know. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She nodded. "Good," she said. That was all. But the way she said it, not relieved, not approving, simply acknowledging a thing completed, told him more than a longer response would have. She had expected him to do it. She had stopped waiting to see whether he would, and moved on to what came next. That shift in her expectations, small and unannounced, cost him something he did not have a name for and would not have traded. The 6 weeks passed in that register. Not warmth, not yet, not reliably, but a gradual and unsentimental thaw, the kind that happens in the ground before it happens in the air. He was present. That was the first and most repeated fact of those 6 weeks. He did not travel. He did not find reasons to be elsewhere. He sat at his desk in the house he had previously treated as a posting inn, and he worked, and he ate dinner at the table where Vivian sat, and he went to the nursery in the dark and stood over Edward's cradle, and the accumulation of those days built something that had no dramatic moment of construction, only the evidence of itself in retrospect. Edward gained weight. The physician stopped using the word cautious in front of optimistic. His cry lost its questioning quality and acquired something more declarative, more certain of its own right to be heard. Vivian watched this with the attention of someone monitoring a structure they have invested everything in, and the watching had a quality to it, a fierce, exhausted, unperformative love that Damien witnessed every day and understood he had nearly cost her entirely. He did not tell himself this to punish himself. He told it to himself as a fact, the way you hold a compass bearing, not to dwell on where you were, but to stay oriented about where you were going. The Pemberton Winter Ball fell on the 15th of December. The estate was 2 hours from London, large enough to contain 400 guests without strain, and by the time Damien's carriage arrived, the entrance was lit with torchlight that turned the falling snow gold. He helped Vivian down from the carriage. She was in dark blue, not the pale colors she had worn before the birth, not the careful neutrality of a woman trying not to take up space. She had dressed with intent tonight, with the specific deliberateness of a person who understands they are walking into a room that has already been talking about them and has decided to make that room's job more difficult. She took his arm. Her grip was steady. Inside, the ballroom was exactly what he had expected. 400 people arranged in the careful formations of English society at its most theatrical, everyone aware of who had arrived and with whom, the conversations layered in the specific way of rooms where everything said aloud is the less important half of what is being communicated. They saw the looks. Both of them. The small recalibrations that moved through clusters of people as Damien and Vivian passed, heads turning a degree, conversations pausing and resuming at a different angle. The story had been moving through this room for 6 weeks, carried on the invisible current that connected these people, and it was here now in the way these things were always here, not spoken, but present, hovering in every slight hesitation and overly warm greeting. Damien felt Vivian's arm tighten fractionally against his. He covered her hand with his and kept walking. Celine was near the east windows. She was in cream and gold, and she was positioned with the unconscious precision of someone who has selected their location in a room the way a general selects terrain, visible, well lit, adjacent to the conversation clusters that mattered. She had not looked toward the entrance when they arrived, which meant she had been watching it. She saw them. Something moved through her face, not surprise, she was past surprise, but a recalibration, the brief visible adjustment of someone shifting from one prepared position to another. She did not approach. 40 minutes passed. Damien moved through the room with Vivienne. He introduced her to 3 men she had not previously met at this level, men whose opinions shaped the financial architecture of English aristocracy. And he introduced her not as his wife, which was her title, but by describing what she had navigated in the past 6 weeks in terms that left no room for the alternative story Celine had been circulating. He did it without announcement, without theater, woven into ordinary conversation in the way that truth, when delivered without performance, tends to be more durable than the alternatives. He watched the recalibrations happen in real time. He watched people do the arithmetic of two competing narratives and arrive, one by one, at the same conclusion: that the woman standing beside the Duke of Blackthorn, composed and direct, and clearly the axis around which her husband was orienting, was not the woman the other story described. It was not enough on its own. He knew that. Narratives did not die in one evening, and Celine had been thorough. But he was not trying to kill the story tonight. He was trying to starve it. When Celine finally moved, it was with the decision of someone who has waited as long as waiting was useful. She came toward Vivian from across the room, through a gap in the crowd that Damien registered a half-second before it opened, and he understood, too late to reposition, not too late to be present, that this was the encounter she had come for, that everything tonight had been arranged around this approach, this angle, this specific gathering of witnesses. "Vivienne," Celine said. Warm. The warmth was extraordinary, actually. The sustained performance of it, the seamlessness. "You look wonderfully recovered. I was so relieved to hear the child was thriving." The room did not stop. It continued its noise and motion, but the people nearest to them, 8, 10, the precise number required to constitute a public moment, were listening. Vivian looked at Celine. In the 6 weeks since Celine had been in the entrance hall of Blackthorn, something had finished settling in Vivian's face. The storm water quality of her eyes had not changed, but what was behind them had, the raw, close to the surface quality of the early days after the birth, had been replaced by something that sat further back, quieter, more permanent. The look of someone who has processed a thing fully and filed it and is now operating from a position of complete clarity about what it was. "Thank you," Vivian said. Her voice was pleasant, entirely pleasant, and entirely empty of anything that could be used. Celine waited for more. It did not come. "I understand you've been through quite an ordeal," Celine continued. The slight emphasis on ordeal was calibrated, not enough to be clearly hostile, more than enough to remind the nearest witnesses of the story she had been circulating. "Premature births are so frightening, I can only imagine." "I'm sure you can," Vivian said. The pleasantness remained constant. Celine looked at her. Then, with the decision of someone who has assessed the terrain and found the approach she wanted. "And the child? Edward, isn't it? He has Damien's look about him, I'm told. That's a relief, with everything—" "Lady Whitmore," Damien's voice. Not loud. He did not need loud. He had spent 20 years developing the register that required neither volume nor repetition, the register that contained within it the full understanding of what he was capable of and the implicit communication that it was currently being applied. Every person within 8 feet heard it and registered it. Celine turned to look at him. He had spent 6 weeks deciding what this moment would be, not planning specific language. The specific language had resolved itself, as it always did, in the moment itself. What he had decided was the nature of it. Not a threat, not a political maneuver, not the carefully managed exposure he might have engineered 4 months ago when his primary concern was the protection of his own position. Those tools belonged to the version of himself that had stood at a villa window and accepted a convenient silence without pulling at it. What he had decided was honesty, the kind that cost something, the kind Vivian had told him he had never attempted. "My son," he said, in the same register, to Celine and to the 10 people near them, and to the room that was, by now, doing the thing rooms did when they understood something was happening, going quieter, without going silent, turning its attention to a single point, "is my son. My wife nearly died delivering him in a house I was not present in because of a series of arrangements you made and a series of choices I made." He held her gaze. "I have spent 6 weeks being honest about my choices. I'm going to continue being honest about them, including, if necessary, in rooms considerably less comfortable than this one." Celine's face was very still. "The letter you have," he said, "has already been disclosed. To Harcastle, 2 weeks ago, in full. Whatever you intended to do with it, that window is closed." A pause. "And the story you have been circulating about my son's parentage is false, which you know, which I know, and which I am now going to make it my specific purpose to ensure everyone in this room also knows." He looked at her steadily. "We're done. Whatever you built, whatever you planned, it's done. I am suggesting, clearly and finally, that you find a different future than the one you designed around my family." The silence had a texture now. It was the silence of a room that has witnessed something that cannot be taken back. The silence of a story that has encountered its counter-narrative in the most public possible venue. Celine stood in the middle of it. She was not a woman who showed damage easily. She had built herself to be resistant to damage. But there was something in her face in that moment, something that had to do with the gap between the plan she had built and the ground she was standing on, that was not quite concealed. She looked at Damien. She looked at Vivian. She made, in the space of approximately 3 seconds, the calculation she had been making and revising for 8 months, and arrived at a final answer. She turned and walked away. Not hurrying. She did not hurry. That much dignity she kept. She moved through the crowd with her head up and her pace controlled, and people moved aside for her, and she reached the far door and went through it, and the room exhaled around the space where she had been. Vivian was looking at the floor. Just for a moment, the brief downward look of someone absorbing the end of something they had been braced for a long time. Then she looked up, and she looked at Damien, and what was in her face was not triumph and was not relief. It was something quieter than both and more durable. He had told the truth in a room full of people, and it had cost him the control he had previously mistaken for strength. He understood, standing in that ballroom with the gold light and the snow against the windows and his wife's eyes on him, that this was what she had needed from him. Not the exposure of Celine, not the political maneuvering, not even the trip to Hardcastle. The willingness to stand somewhere and be seen without management, to be accountable in the place where accountability was most expensive. He had not known he was capable of it until 6 weeks ago, when she had staked everything on the possibility that he was. "Can we go home?" she said. "Yes," he said. They left before the supper course. Months. The carriage ride back to Blackthorn took 2 hours through snow that had thickened since they arrived, the world gone white and quiet and indifferent to the evening they had just come through. Vivian sat across from him in the rocking dark. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "She'll leave London," Vivian said finally. "Not a question. Within the month. There's nothing left for her here that isn't going to cost her more than it's worth. Will the Pemberton thing follow you?" "For a while. Hardcastle has managed the framing. It won't end my seat." A pause. "It will cost me something in the short term, some political distance from men who prefer their alliances uncomplicated." "And you're all right with that?" He looked at her across the dark carriage. "I'm all right with that." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the snow through the window. Then, "You didn't tell me you were going to say what you said tonight, about being absent, about your choices." "No." "Why?" He thought about this honestly. "Because if I had told you, it would have been something I prepared, something performed, and you would have known the difference." She turned from the window to look at him. The carriage swayed, the snow moved against the glass. "Yes," she said. "I would have." Blackthorn appeared out of the dark and snow at midnight. The lights in the lower windows visible first, then the mass of the old stone, then the gate. The carriage turned through it and came to rest, and Damien got out and helped Vivian down. And they stood for a moment in the snow in front of the house that had been his and was now theirs in a way it had not previously been. The distinction small and enormous. Inside, the house was warm, Mrs. Harrow had stayed up, which she would not acknowledge as anything other than ordinary professional practice, and she took their coats with her usual brisk economy and told them that Edward had been settled for 3 hours and had taken his feeding without complaint and was, in her professional assessment, considerably more opinionated than he had been last week, which she delivered as a medical report and which Damien understood as the highest possible endorsement. They went to the nursery. Edward was asleep. He was bigger than he had been 6 weeks ago. Not dramatically, not in a way you would notice if you had only met him once, but in a way that the people who had watched him fight his way through the first weeks of his life recognized as something earned. His face, relaxed in sleep, had Vivian's line to the jaw and something around the brow that Damien could not trace to either of them and had decided simply belonged to Edward, who was already, at 6 weeks old, in possession of a personality that had no interest in being attributed to anyone but himself. Damien stood over the cradle. Vivian stood beside him. They stood there together in the quiet of the house, in the warmth of the nursery, in the particular silence of two people who have been through something that cannot be undone and are still standing on the same side of it. Not unchanged, He was not fool enough to think that what had happened left anything unchanged. He had been cracked open like old stone by water finding its way through, and he would never be the precise shape he had been before. And he understood now that this was not loss. It was the necessary cost of being a different kind of person than the one he had been. The person who stood at villa windows, who accepted convenient silences, who confused the management of his life for the living of it. Vivienne reached into the cradle and touched Edward's hand. The tiny fingers curled, the reflex that was not quite reflex anymore, that had been acquiring intention week by week. "He's going to be difficult," she said softly. "Yes." Strong-willed, stubborn. "Yes." "He gets that from you." He looked at her. She was looking at Edward with the expression she always had in this room. That fierce, exhausted, unperformative thing that he had come to understand was the realest thing he had ever been in proximity to. She had not said she forgave him. She had not said she loved him. Not with those words, not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. But she was here, standing beside him in the dark, touching their son's hand and including him in a joke about stubbornness. And he understood that what she was offering was not sentiment but presence, the same thing she had demanded of him, the same currency, and that it was, from a woman who had nearly died alone in this house while he was 30 miles away, an act of considerable courage. He reached into the cradle and covered her hand with his, very lightly, the way you touch something you have come close to losing and have not yet stopped being afraid of. She did not move her hand away. They stood like that for a moment, the three of them, the sleeping child, the woman who had survived everything that had been thrown at her and come out the other side with her spine intact and her eyes clear, and the man who had spent 6 weeks learning what it cost to be worthy of the word trust. And outside the windows the snow fell without urgency on the moors and the old stone of the house that had been cold for a long time and was, very slowly, learning to be warm. "Come to bed," Vivienne said. She did not look at him when she said it. She pulled her hand gently from beneath his and moved toward the door, and paused at the threshold, and did not look back but waited. He took one more look at his son, at the small chest rising and falling in its steady, hard-won rhythm, at the face that belonged entirely to itself. Then he crossed the nursery and went to the door where Vivienne was waiting, and they left the room together, and behind them Edward breathed on in the dark, quiet, and certain and entirely unaware of the story he had been born into, and had, simply by surviving it, already begun to change. 1 year later, the Blackthorn name would mean something different than it had meant before that November storm. Not because the scandal had been erased, scandals did not erase, they simply became part of the sediment, but because the man who carried the name had stopped carrying it the same way. He carried it now the way you carry something you have chosen rather than inherited, with the knowledge of what it cost and the decision, renewed every morning over a cradle in a dark nursery, to be equal to it. Vivienne became, in that year, the woman England had not known she already was, present at every table her husband sat at, consulted on every decision that affected the estate and the people on it, moving through the aristocracy with the specific authority of someone who has been tested at the level that matters and has not broken. Not fearsome in the way Damien was fearsome, differently, more interesting. The kind of authority that comes from having no performance left, from having shed it all in a cold room in November and come out the other side with only what was real. And Damien Blackthorn, the most powerful nobleman in England, learned in the year after the storm what he had never had occasion to learn before, that the hardest thing a man built the way he was built could do was not intimidate or dominate or endure. It was to stand in a room full of people and be seen without armor. To say, to anyone who asked, that he had been absent when it mattered, and had spent every day since then choosing to be present. To say it not as confession, but as fact, with the flat clarity of a man who has stopped needing the version of himself that would have been too proud to say it. He was not good at it, not naturally. It was work, every day. Some days harder than others, but he did it. On the anniversary of the night he almost lost everything, he sat beside Vivienne at the Pemberton ball. Different year, same room, the room that had witnessed the end of Celine's architecture and the beginning of something that had no name yet, except ongoing. And he held her hand at the supper table without minding who saw, and she let him, and Edward was at home with Greta, sleeping through the night for the first time, with the confident unconsciousness of a child who has no doubt about where he is or whether he is wanted. Damien looked at his wife. She was talking to the woman beside her about something he was not following, and her face in the candlelight had the quality it had now in unguarded moments, open in a way it had not been 2 years ago, not soft exactly, still entirely itself, but with the walls arranged differently, some of them down, the ones that had come down because they no longer served a purpose. She glanced at him, caught him looking, held it for a second. "What?" she said, the way she said it now, half challenge, half something else. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him for another moment with those gray eyes that had seen every version of him and had chosen, against all reasonable odds, to remain in the same room as the current one. Then she turned back to her conversation. He kept her hand. Outside the windows of the Pemberton estate, the English winter was doing what it always did. Relentless, indifferent, cold enough to be honest. Inside, the candles burned and the room was full of people who told stories about each other to make sense of a world that refused to hold still. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, without announcement, without drama, Damien Blackthorne held his wife's hand in a room full of witnesses and understood that this ordinary, costly, irreplaceable thing was the only title that had ever mattered.